You guys, he's gonna pop up from underneath the desk like a jack in the box.
Inside me?
Or Tim Holtz's booth.
Oh, yeah, yours. Yeah, you're right. I couldn't sign up. There was no space.
There he is. See, he just popped up like a jack in the box.
Yeah, I came up from the basement, so. All right, we excited. We are going to kick this off. Creativation 2020.
Woo-hoo!
I know, right? Isn't that cool?
We're your first group.
Whole new decade of creativity, man. We're ready to go. So I'm going to take you through and just talk about the highlights of what's new in the world of distress. For me, I'm always just looking for different ways that we can alter things that we do. And distress has come a long way throughout the years, from inks to paints and stains and crayons and markers and oxide, right? So new at the show are distress embossing glazes. And really, embossing glazes they're embossing powders. That's what they are. There's nothing unique from its actual material, but what makes them unique in the world of distress is that these are all translucent. And that's why we called it a glaze. And in embossing powders, some embossing powders, most powders are opaque, right? When you have a black embossing powder or a red or a white, it's designed that when you put it on, that is the color. It doesn't matter what's under it. And there are some translucent powders in our world. There's many. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but I will say that these are designed that when they melt, they're always translucent, and its melted color is what mimics the coordinating distress color, right? So these are all distress glazes melted over a brown background, and you're welcome to pass it around and get your best money shot out of that. But the cool thing about it, as you can see, is that when they melt, besides that they melt to a beautiful shine, they are translucent, showing what's underneath. So if you put them over, like for example, distress ink, you're gonna still see all of the drips, the texture, all of the stuff that you get with distress, but that color of glaze is tinting what it's over, right? So for example here, these swatches, yeah, feel free to pass them around and take a look and scan through them. So these swatches right here show you the glaze in action. You can use the glaze over something stamped. And just looking at this one tag, right? When you see this is just stamped in Black Soot Archival, when you put the glaze over it, it even intensifies the black, right? It takes anything that you put over and almost magnifies it, gives it just a beautiful effect. Now, in addition to the glaze, of course, I was like, well, how do I want to use these, right? So the inspiration really behind the glaze, besides adding color, we're all around these paper dolls and baseboard dolls. People are using these in everything, and they're even using their own photos now, so like this kind of gave them permission to print them out, cut them out, and just use them. And I wanted different ways that we can color them, and throughout the years we've colored them with markers and crayons, but the glaze is really fun because not only does it tint it, but it gives it that shine. So these swatches are done strictly with the glaze. There's no ink used at all. Your color is just the glaze. And so that's how you can see this Tattered Rose has such a great effect, or Cracked Pistachio, or Peeled Paint. And even whether it's going over light or dark, it completely changes it, and it gives it a great texture too. So these swatches really pass it around, like feel it. I always say in my Facebook Lives, like, wish we had feel-o-vision, you know, where they could just like touch the screen and go, that's amazing. The cool thing about glazes as well is that the more you build, the more intense the color is. So anyone that understands distress ink that have used it, you know that the more color you add, the more intense. So you can build these up as well through a stencil, through all different things. And I wanted different ways that we could adhere our powders. Obviously we have embossing ink. That's what we've had this in the line, and this is if you're gonna stamp with it or do whatever. But we needed some new tools as well. Now, again, there's nothing special to this particular liquid if you already have something similar, okay? If you have an embossing pen, there's nothing in this pen that makes it special to work with this. You can use any kind of embossing pen, but because we do a line, we wanted it complete. So the Distress embossing pens are just pens that have embossing ink. There are two different tips in a package, a bullet and a brush. And that's just a nice way that we can apply clear ink and get our powders to stick to. So if you do lettering, you can do your hand lettering with a brush pen and put your glaze on, or any of these that I wanted to add that glaze, I just colored with the pen, put the powder on, and off we go. The dabber, there's been a lot of embossing dabbers. Reinker still has one in their line, but it's that paint dabber with the foam. And when you're working in mixed media, you have to be careful with embossing ink. Embossing ink is glycerin. It's very slimy. If you ever felt it, it's that kind of greasy look. And if you're doing mixed media things, like you want to put this on something like metal or wood, this is all done with glaze, right? So here's just the back of that ideology clip. That's what it looks like. And this is what that clip looks like with hickory smoke glaze over the top.
Look at that.
Totally changes it, right? So when you're embossing on metal or like on wood, these are the number blocks, right? And this is the glaze. You have some options here. To get this to stick, the nice thing about this dabber is it's just a fabric top. right? So just like a stamp cleaner or something like that, you're gonna get a very light application of that ink. You're not gonna get it really wet or goopy. So if you put too much embossing ink on metal, even though the powder will melt, it's gonna wipe off because that ink has no place to go. So now it's trapped between plastic and metal and it's just gonna slide off. So that's why we wanted a light way. Another cool thing, obviously, for the tag is I just took my dabber, swiped it on, put my glaze on it. So if you do art journaling or planning or chipboard, right, you can just take this and instead of smashing it into your ink pad, now we can just take our embossing dabber, put it on, and get our powder on there. So little things to kind of think about. Another cool thing about the glaze before I start cooking this up is that if you don't want it shiny, because it will dry shiny, you can get it to dry or melt matte. And the reason is it's not really changing how we do it. All you do is go over it with steel wool when it's done. You don't need to add any other mediums over the top. A little piece of steel wool after it melts and cools, you go over the top and that takes away that high gloss shine and gives you a really cool dimensional, almost wax-like look and feel.
Would sandpaper work too? Or?
Sandpaper wouldn't because it would actually carve it out because it's still plastic. So this is just taking off the sheen. You can also use things like collage medium or gel medium painted over it to dull it down. But the easiest way for me is just a little steel wool, go over it, and there you go. So let's take some of these out. Let's cook them up, play around with them. I always like to, and you know, I think in today's world of makers, we're swatch savvy now. We have swatches. We just like to make swatches, even if we don't do anything else with them other than have swatches.
That's what we do, the swatches.
That's what we have. I took them out of the crayon tin, so the jars do fit in a distressed crayon tin if you're looking for a storage option. But the powders, don't be fooled by the color on the jar. We're still gonna get a translucent look. So if you're expecting, like if you're matching this up and saying, oh, I want this really bright turquoise when I do it, you're gonna need to put something white over this. So another thing to think about with glaze is any ink that you would normally emboss with, a pigment ink, paint, you can still use under the glaze. Don't think like you can only use these sticky things. Even distressed people, right? You can emboss with distress ink. So we can still stamp with a color, emboss with a different color glaze, and get a whole different kind of thing going on. This one right here, this is showing texture paste, which is a white paste. It's now part of the distress line, but any embossing paste, because it is white, these glazes were sprinkled over the top of it and then embossed, and you can see that that's what's going to give you a truer color, because now we have a white foundation. We're not seeing through it, we're just getting that white to reflect it. So it's really nice that we can take these colors, and I just went in and sprinkled them just to show you that because they are translucent, all of them, and because they are a plastic, so when they melt they become liquid, that if you went in and you just started sprinkling them on, so I put my paste on, and while my paste was wet, I sprinkled on my glazes. I did my little tap dance, because when you do that, it's what gets the colors to bounce. In other words, if I sprinkled my color and I did this, whatever was here dominated everything else, right? You ever done that? Tried to color with powder and you flick it? That last color just covered everything. So if you just do the dance, that's gonna get all these colors to start popping around and sticking into different random areas. And when they melt, they will actually blend, just like a color would, because it's melted plastic. So when you heat this, where that green overlaps that blue, overlaps that brown, that powder starts to melt, and you can get really cool, authentic, very unique looking glaze combos.
Does the past need to have any special features so that I can emboss it? Can we use any embossing paste? Or
I think you can use any. I mean, I've only used Reinker, so but I would suggest trying with what you have. Yeah, the thing about paste that you have to be careful with, some paste gets really puffy, like marshmallow, you know, so if that's happening, you may want to let it dry first, meaning put the paste on, put your glaze on, and then let it dry. So the powder's now stuck to the paste, but if you let the paste dry before you heat emboss it, you probably won't get that marshmallow explosion, right?
But you did this, you dried it right away after you put in the
because
paste.
I know that you really should feel it. You're gonna see that it's got a real nuggety texture because the texture paste can handle heat drying.
It's
well,
almost
you know
like
me, I'm super impatient.
It's very rough. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I forget, you know, if I don't do it right away, I'm gonna totally forget. All right, let's go in. I'm just gonna do something under here just to show you how this works. So the dabber itself, it is a thick embossing ink. So when you press down, you can apply a little bit of pressure to get some ink out, but if you go in and just squeeze this, you'll pop this sucker right off.
Oh.
Done it, okay? Right? Because it's not designed to flood color. And I was so used to like a paint dabber or a stain where I'm like squeezing and pushing down, just pop it back on and know to never do that again. But I don't know if your camera's picking this up. I tried to do it on the mat just to show you the shine. There is ink that is coming out of this. I'm gonna show you. And you see that little bit of shine right
Yeah,
there?
there's
It's
a
just
little bit.
very faint. That's what it's for. That's all you need. So if we're going to do this over something, let's just take a stamp.
Will you see it wet? Like it will show wet?
It will show wet. So I'm going to do my best because I know you guys are videoing, so I want to play to you guys. So just like tip it this way, this way. Yeah, show me this. It is like a movie. I'll take this block. So I'll just take a little flourish. Let's put this down. We'll stamp with some archival. Any color archival, but I'll just show you black because I know a lot of people just like to stamp.
So you're
with black.
okay, so you're stamping.
I'm
and
just
then-
going to stamp so you can see the glaze over an image. I
Okay.
think when you see it happen, it's so much more impactful.
And you're using archival because it won't move after you
Correct.
put your. Okay.
But technically, you could stamp with distress because this plays well over distress.
Oh, nice.
See
What
that?
about
Okay.
oxides?
Yeah. So it will play beautiful over oxide. I have a sample. You know me. I'm that what if child. Okay. So this was me saying, okay, if I did a tag in oxide, so this was aged mahogany oxide, and when I first did the glaze, I'm like, well, I'm sure I could achieve the same thing with clear embossing powder. Like, let's be honest, plastic. So this was clear.
Okay.
Well, it did nothing. Like, it's boring. It was very boring to me. I'm like, okay, well now it just kind of looks like a weird milky streak. This right here
That's cool.
is fired brick. So when I put fired brick over that, I'm like, okay, now we got some deep color. It brought, I thought, more depth in. And then after it cooled, like I wonder if we could would it still stay pliable? Could I still break it? Could I still die cut it? And I mean, feel it, it's not gonna chip off, but it changes the surface of that paper. That to me is
That's
what's
really
unique about a medium is although it's an embossing powder, just don't treat it like an embossing powder. You could still stamp and emboss. You could go through just with a stamped image, but it's really designed to like be used with distress. Don't be afraid of it. All right, so here I'm just gonna take this, and I'm just gonna stamp on cardstock. I just happen to be stamping on watercolor cardstock just for the sake of stamping, all right? I'll just clean it off the way I like to clean it.
Everyone, we hope you've all downloaded the Creativation mobile app and are using it to navigate the event, your schedule, and plan for the show floor. We recommend regularly pressing the refresh button on your Creativation app, located in the top right-hand corner on the home screen, to ensure you're seeing the most updated information. If you have any questions, please visit the show office. Have fun out there.
Okay. So I just wanted my archival to dry. It doesn't really matter. Archival's a pretty fast drying ink, but I'm a chronic heat tool user because I'm that guy that like will forget that step, so it just becomes very automatic. So I'm just going to take the dabber and I'm just going to start swiping over this and try to get you to see. Can you see that little shine right there? Can you see just that little bit of shimmer? It's not a lot. That's the whole idea. It's not supposed to be. So we can dab this out. I can go around the edge and I'm just going to swipe over this. Just in part of the area. I didn't dry it completely, and that's okay. All right, so now we'll take a color of glaze. Let's do a little bit of cracked pistachio, that'll be good. And I'm just going to pour this on. Now again, if you want to mix, you can mix. If you want to thin your color, like I've even played with taking glaze and also mixing it with just clear embossing powder to get like a more translucent, right? So if you think, oh, that color is a little too green and I want it to be softer, that's okay, mix your powders ahead of time. You know, take a little cup, do one part clear to one part this, and you'll get even a more translucent color. And I say that meaning it's not gonna lighten the color, but because you're gonna have less of those granules, it just gets a little speckly. It's pretty neat. So you could definitely play around with your
You
different
did that
colors.
very neat. I would have had it everywhere.
Cardstock,
I gotta have a tray.
Cardstock is your friend.
I know, but I would have
creates
had
a
it.
nice little funnel, and then
I
of
gotta
course
have a
someone
tray
else's
with
carpet
edges.
is also your friend.
That's true. Someone else's carpet.
Yeah. This is how we do it. All right, so you can see here that I just have glaze over there, and that glaze is very dulling, right? Dulls that stamped image. So we're going to emboss it. Now, I'm a firm believer in different tools, okay? This is Reinker's heat tool. If you see any videos, I use it. It's a craft tool. I use it for crafting. I use it for drying ink, drying paint, drying glue. It's a craft tool. Although it says you can emboss with it, you could if you had unlimited time, right? If you had 20 minutes to emboss this, I guess you would. An embossing gun, these are both the same temperature, but this focuses heat. Any embossing gun focuses that temperature in one area, and that's what melts the powder quicker. So that's why I use an embossing gun, any embossing gun. Always heat it up. You'll know if it's hot by just sticking your hand in front of it. And then another trick to embossing is hold your paper up, okay? If you have sensitive fingers, use a clothespin, right? Something to grab onto it. But by holding this up, this is going to allow the heat to pass through the paper, and it embosses almost instantly. And that's what it should do. You can see how that color just changed right away. Right, see that dark black and that color? So anytime you're embossing, even a card, if you can just hold it off of the table, it allows your heat to go through your paper. And not only will it emboss in half the time, but it's going to keep your paper flat. Have you ever done embossing on a card and you do this and your paper curls up? Heat rises. So you're putting heat through the paper, it's looking for a way to get out, and that's what makes your card look like a potato chip. See that heat that went through it? See it disappear? Do it again. Heat goes through it. No, that won't do it. All right. So this, let me get this little area right here. You can see when it's embossed because of that wonderful shine, that sheen. And look at how it made that black ink even darker, right? So even if you're just using it and you want to use, like antique linen was one of the colors, because I just thought, well, what if I don't want to add color? What if I just want that black to be darker but a little bit vintage? Antique linen's really nice because it's a very subtle color. You can see over the top. Almost kind of has a peachy hue to it. But it's really, really nice to add that cool effect over the top of it. So that is like the premise of a glaze. Now, a doll using the pen. This is fun. People just like, I don't know, just like coloring these. They're hilarious. People name them. They have like their entire family devoted to them. So there's nothing wrong with that. All right, let's use her. I'm gonna give her a coat. So I prefer a brush when I'm doing them, just because I feel like my lines are a little bit more organic and not so perfect, but it's whatever you want to do. Now, when you're coloring this, because it's clear ink, and I'll show you, these pens are super juicy. I don't know if you can see the juiciness in there. Can you see the shine? Is that working for you? Yeah. Yeah? Okay. Is that working for you? Yeah. It's very, very wet. So because it's a clear ink and you're like, how do I know if I have it? Just tip it to the light until you see that shine. If you get ink where you don't want it, wipe it off before you apply the powder. It's easier than trying to wipe the powder and the ink off at the same time, okay? So I just suggest looking at it and saying, okay, I want to change this. So I'll leave her hand free, I'll just go right down. And we're just gonna color this on there. Perfect. All right. And same thing, just gonna take a glaze. I think we'll do some vintage photo. That'll be cool. Same thing, just put this on. And if you're doing the dolls, of course, you could sit there and say, okay, I'm gonna do this a color, a collar, a different color, and you can put your colors on. So if you're gonna do different colors, I would put my pen down, do my powder, heat it, and then I would go in and do another color. Okay, I don't really like to do powder on powder because static is static, right? So even if you went in with a pen and you put green, the static charge is gonna get it everywhere. So if you wanna use multiple colors, go through the full steps of putting your ink down, your glaze down, and then you're gonna heat it. All right? Here's another good move. How about the dismount? Same thing, I'll try to hold it just so you guys can see that. So even on something like chipboard, it just melts very, very quickly. It is a fine powder. I wouldn't say that it's ultra fine, but it's certainly not a thick powder. And always emboss away from your finger.
It will burn.
Yeah, it will burn. Look at that. It's so stinking fast. So you've got that great tinted, shiny, and you could still go in at this point and go in with your markers, your crayons, do whatever it is that you want to do to that doll. All right. So another thing we can do. Let's talk about. Let's just talk about this. This would be cool. So I have a tag, I have a background. I've done with distress, you know, whatever elements you want. It doesn't have to be with distress. It could be whatever. This happens to be done with some mica. I'll do this one. It's kind of like that. And you say, oh, you know what? I want to add a little element to it. So paper doesn't have a memory. So if you're one of those embossers and your paper does something, just undo it. Okay? It's not going to remember that it needed to be like that. But maybe I want to go in. I think I'm going to add some blue. So we'll do some broken china on this one. So here I will take my sprayer, get it going, prime the pump, dripper, all right. And I'm just gonna go in and I'm just gonna add a little flick of water. And let's add a kind of a drip right there. Next I'm going to take some of the glaze. Because I like to work with water with my distress, you can emboss with water.
Who would have thought?
So what's nice about that is obviously we get way more control than we would with ink. And plus I don't know how to get embossing ink to act like that. You know, I can't imagine embossing ink acting so light and faint. So this is really a great way that we can add some glaze to something that we want to distress, right? So whether you're spraying water, even if you went in with a water brush and kind of went around the edge, you can emboss with that. Because the powder is thin enough, you don't have those big chunks that go flying off. Now I will say that embossing water takes a little bit longer because we need the water to, you need the water to actually evaporate, right? But it doesn't take much longer. But you can see like in those areas, see this one drip I'm focusing on? Watch it. See, there it goes, there it goes, there it goes.
That'd be fun for a resist technique too.
It just takes a little bit longer, yeah. It's very, very cool. So this could be a top glaze, this could be a resist. In the ideology booth, you'll see the stuff is used in many, many different ways. I know that Stacy, when she did her designer spotlight project, used it as a resist behind some paper with some weathered wood. I know Paula used it as like a top layer to accent a die cut. Just a lot of different ways to use it. But I just think this, adding this effect over a background, just adding that little bit of shine, pretty cool. Especially the fact that we could then ink over the top of it. And this didn't have to be haphazard. We could have taken a stencil and sprayed some water and then get kind of that spray flourishy pattern if it was a big stencil. So the whole idea with any new medium is play around with it. So this one, instead of spraying, I did like flicking. You know, put water in your hand and just flick to get bigger drips. But you can even see how it embosses. It embosses that splat.
That's cool.
That's just cool. Yeah. So it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, hello, Captain Obvious. I didn't invent embossing powder. I'm not claiming I did, but I'm trying to introduce a different way to use embossing powder in what you do. And by having something fully translucent, we start thinking all of the different backgrounds that we have. Man, adding some glaze and cracking it, amazing. Adding glaze to add a tint, incredible. Using it just to stamp over something where you don't have that bold image in the foreground, excellent. Putting it over the top of something textured, very cool. That's really why it was more of a glaze, because I wanted you to always think of it as like this top layer. Like what could I do, like a glazed donut. Glazed donut's not inside the donut, it's on the top of it. So think of these glazes as what can I do to accent or alter what I've already done. And so everything that you have, from stickers to chipboard to metal embellishments, you know, it changes everything. And when you start playing around with different color combos, that's going to also allow you to either use it as its own, right? Use it as its colorant. And that's a weird thing because, you know, obviously I've been an inker for many years. So my first instinct is like, put the ink down, then do something. But for me, because the color's in there, it's just like clear and off you go. And then playing around with different opportunities of ways to either steel wool it or using it with water, that to me is what makes the distressed glazes like, it's just different. Very cool. So that is kind of the overview of glaze, and then we're going to talk about some other mediums. Any questions on the glaze before I move on? It's pretty neat, right? It's one of those dumb things, but when you see kind of all the different things you can do, you're like, okay.
I get it.
I get it.
I didn't know you could do it with water. That's awesome.
Yeah, water's very cool. And that was the other thing, you know, when it comes to embossing powder, because embossing powder is just plastic. Everyone's embossing powder in the world, it's plastic, okay? And it just grinds up differently, and there's different kind of plastics, and some are metallic plastics and opaque and transparent. But the grind is everything, right? So like ultra thick, back in the day, ultra thick embossing powder, it wasn't thicker, it was just chunkier, so when it melted thicker, right? So there was nothing about that plastic that changed it. So super fine detail. What makes it super fine is it's so delicate and almost like dust that it provides way more detail when you're embossing. So this one was kind of in between because I do love working with water. You know that. I'm like a flicker, a spritzer, a sprayer, and I thought, well, I want that with the glaze. I want my glaze to be, and you still use it with resist spray or anything like that, but water is everything,
cool.
man. It's
Yep.
cool. Okay, so some other things that we have in the Distress line, we have some new mediums, and we also have a new cardstock. So the cardstock I'll talk about because I think as card makers or mixed media artists, whether we want to work with die cuts or stamps, I think we're all paper junkies. It doesn't have to be pattern paper, we're just looking for the next great texture. And so I did a paper called Cracked Leather Cardstock, and this is available pre-cut, 4 1/4, 5 1/2, or 8 1/2 by 11. And what it is a very heavyweight paper, similar to watercolor, but I think this one's like, this is 111, watercolor is 118, close enough. But what it is, it has a texture. See if I'll pass this around so you guys get your best money shot. Texture, flat. Okay, so just like watercolor cardstock, we can stamp on either side, but when you add your mediums to it, you really get it to look like leather. So we can add this paper to a box, we can add it to the front of a planner or a journal, so we can get the look of leather from our die cuts, our punches, anything we want. And this is just done using ink, a little crayon, a little bit of paint. This one is just ink blending with some water. This is just spraying. So I just like to show swatches that there's no perfect recipe, but you could have pink cracked leather if you wanted to do like a patent leather typewriter that you were going to die cut, or you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to go to the dark side like I do. Like my first thing, I'm like, how will it look in brown? You know, everyone else.
How will it look in brown?
How will it look in brown? Yeah, and then out of all, I talk about the designer spotlight, which I encourage you to see during the show. So this year, what Reinker did is they took each of the designers. We were able to take our brand and we were able to reach out to 5 makers out there, right? Not 5 designers, not 5 well-known artists, just 5 makers that each had a unique style in how they used our product. There were no other rules to that. So I reached out to people thinking, well, I knew what each person did, like Stacy was one of them. Like, Stacy's gonna do some color stuff. Paula would be very vintage and shabby. Emma Williams, very soft and florally. Yeah, no. The only one I knew was gonna be grungy was Zoe. I knew that Zoe was gonna go full on brown. What did everybody do? Brown. So when I got the project back, I'm like, oh my God. Like, Paula, why'd you use brown? I'm like, Stacy, brown. She's like, it just spoke to me as brown. I'm like, okay. Jennifer McGuire, I knew was just going to be a bag of Skittles that blew up. So I knew, like, there was no even convincing her to use brown. I was safe. So I did all 64 colors. So that panel on the top, I'm like, well, nobody used color. I'll just use them all just to show you. But that,
Call me next time. I use color.
You'll use color.
Yeah, I use color too.
We'll get you in the mix. Absolutely. The cool thing about Reinker as well, and if you do any type of media or social media, introduce yourself to Kelly. She's here in the booth. She does social media for Reinker. I'm serious. We're always looking for makers, right? Don't have a design team, don't have anything like that. But if you're just a maker that genuinely likes the product and likes to share it, that's who we want.
Well, you sent me my splat box.
Yeah.
So.
And didn't it change your life?
It did change my life.
It was the funniest video I ever saw. You're like, I bought the sprays. I hate sprays. I don't even know why I bought sprays.
I did. I
And
totally
yet, here
slammed
they
on
are.
it. I'm totally honest.
She did. She's like, and yet here they are in front of me. What was I thinking? And then like the very next thing, she's like, I went out and bought more. And I was like, there we go. That's what it is. Like, so the cracked leather, when we use it, and here I'll pass these around so you guys can take shots at it. It has a very subtle texture to it because, as always, we still want to stamp on it. We still want to use rub-ons. We still want to be able to print on it if you want to run through a printer. But it's a beautiful cardstock to work with. So I'll take this. I'll use some Distress. Felt off. So here we can go with some Distress ink, or we can use a spray. All right. So when I ink, I'm just going to go right onto my media mat. So if you're very light-handed, you can see that it'll leave that white in there. It's still a really nice textured paper, right? So you can see that if I was going to do pink or teal or something where I wanted it to be very shabby, I could do that. But obviously, the more water or the more ink you add, you can really get this grungy. But because of the way the paper is designed, it's still designed to work with water. So your colors are still going to wick through that paper. It's still going to blend. It's not going to hold on to it, right? So you can use it this way, or we could go in with our inks or any of our sprays or stains. We can spray this down.
Oh, and dip it.
We can take our paper, dip through it. So if you want just it to be a little bit lighter, but you can see that now the color is going to soak into the cracks. So yeah, there's no right or wrong way. It's all about play. Play, play, play. Use your mediums in so many different ways. Like if you said, oh, I've never really done that, then that's what you should do for the next week, right? Tell yourself, I'm going to lay down the blending tool. I'm never going to pick it up. I'm going to try to use my inks without a blending tool. And people go, oh. But it teaches you so many different ways that you can use what you have in very fun, very unique ways. I did a demo during Facebook Live, and it was just more of an afterthought, but I did a lot of new detailed stencils with Stampers Anonymous. So this release had, a lot of detailed flourishy stencils and things like that. And I thought, I don't really know if people understand the difference between tools when we stencil, because you know, you see a lot of YouTube videos, and I think everyone is comfortable with some type of blending tool, right? It's like your little sports car. You know, you're going to use ink, you're going to pick this up, and you're in business. But then there's other things. There's blending brushes. There's these really beautiful makeup brushes people are using. You know, me, I'm a little more rough around the edges when it comes to my brushes, because I like them just to be a little bit more, I don't know, I like a natural bristle myself. It's almost like a shaving brush. I just think that it applies ink the way I like it. Let's just put it that way. All right, I need a few things. It's not in there. Oh, you're totally fine. No, this thing's on wheels, man. This is legit. But I'm looking for my little, and I thought I took it out to Holtz. I didn't. What did I do with it, Ben? What you did with it? Y'all see a piece of shelf liner? No? I know, it's a little square of happiness.
I don't think you've had it out.
Where'd it go, Bets? Where'd it go?
Did
I get it out?
I didn't think you had it out.
You don't think I did? Oh, okay.
I could be wrong.
Then I'll go digging.
Can you do Jack in the Box when you come out, please? That would be fun. Okay, thank you.
But you have to do the singing.
This is Tim.
But I had to save her a spot. It's okay.
Big square.
I like her.
It's actually a very small square. All right. I'll make it work. That's gonna sound horrible. It's gonna make my teeth hurt. It's not a very big square, honestly. It's like a little square, but I could have dropped it somewhere. That's the Tim Holtz way. Drop it and find it later.
What is it?
I don't know.
It's a piece of shelf liner. I like to put shelf liner under my ink pads. Just a little square. That keeps my ink from moving when I'm inking.
Oh, that's
right?
smart.
But yeah, if you're using any kind of blending brush, you know that to do this,
Yeah.
you need this. But if you're working, it's just nice to like not have to do this. But a brush, do a stencil. So if I'm going to just do a brush on paper, a brush is always going to give us our softest application of color. And if you're new to inking, that's another thing that's really important to understand, is that if you're new to inking and you're only working with a brush, you're going to want to go with bold colors, because if you try to take light colors, spun sugar, weathered wood, and you're using a brush, you're going to convince yourself your ink pad is all dried out and it doesn't work. And that's not the case. It's that depending on the tool, that's how much intensity of color it's going to apply. And a brush is always going to be the lightest. But because of that bristle, we can really control stencils. That was the whole point of this. So a stencil, for example, using different tools. So this is the new tangled stencil using a blending tool, right? Ink through a stencil, we get this effect. If you simply change by applying the same ink with a brush through the same stencil, you get a completely different detail. So anytime you're working with stencils that have a lot of detail, changing your tool from a blending tool to a brush is going to focus and get those nice thin lines, right? Doesn't mean you always use a brush, right? We can still go and use a blending tool. But if you have that detailed stencil and you're really going for that special pattern, just applying it with a brush is going to get everything to the edges. So having different tools, I think, makes a big difference when it comes to how we apply color and what we apply color to or with, right? Different tools are going to do different things. And you know, as the industry progresses, right, when we're going into more detailed stamps or more detailed stencils, you kind of have to remember all the different tools that we have and why we have them, right? Sometimes we just think, oh, this is what I use and that's all I use. I'm like, well, that's what you use for that. You kind of need to change it up. So in addition to the cardstock in our distress world, we have some other mediums. Okay, wow, jeez, Tim, you're just an absolute wreck today. Different mediums are paste. Now Reinker has had texture paste and crackle paste in their line. They still do, but they put it in the distress line for this show, put it in a little bit smaller jar, just because I think that a lot of mediums,
Blending tool?
you know, today's maker, it's like we always think that if it's in quantity, it's better. I don't think so when it comes to art mediums, because like if you have a bigger pot of something, it just dries out quicker. So when I'm designing, I'm kind of going the opposite way. It's like the taller the jar, when you use it, the more air that's left behind, and your mediums are just going to dry out. So the paste that we have, we've actually changed the size. So texture paste, we have matte texture paste. That's going to be this stuff. And matte texture paste actually dries hard and textural. It is completely matte, but what makes this paste unique is that you can put any medium over it after it dries. So you can put watercolor over it and it will absorb watercolor. You can put dilution sprays, you can put Dina's paints or gloss sprays, you can use distress oxide, anything you want, because most embossing paste resist a water-based medium. Most embossing paste you need to kind of go over with something pigment like a paint or something like that. This will absorb color exactly like paper would. It just sucks in that color and it will also release it. Crackle paste, if you're crack challenged, right? Because we have crackle paste or crazing or whatever, it honestly is a foolproof crackle medium. You put it on, it doesn't have the same thick texture of that, it's much more fluid. You put it on with a palette knife, when it dries, it cracks. It's that simple. And you can apply it to anything you want. If you're going to put it on something like metal or plastic, my advice is put down some collage medium first. Put down a layer of gel medium or collage medium and let it dry, and that's gonna give your surface some tooth. It's going to just allow this to not only dry and crack, but to keep it from like chipping off easier.
Can you heat set it? Because some crackle paste you can heat set.
You can heat set it, but really you get your best crack if you just let it do its thing. Because if you use heat, it wants to separate it quicker. So you get these weird little lines that wouldn't normally appear. It doesn't take very long. I would say probably within like 15 minutes you're going to see it happen. So it is very, very quick. And you'll see here, this is just swipe with a palette knife, just to show you that the thicker the medium, the bigger the cracks, but even the fainter where it's almost non-existent, you'll see crackle. So in the past, a lot of stuff that I've had, like, distressed crackle paint, you had to put it on almost like frosting to get anything to do anything, and this, you put it on and off you go. And same thing, we could add paint, we could add distressed crayon, we could add ink to this, so it's just a very cool medium to work with. Next one is grit paste. We introduced grit paste, which is like this grittier texture paste, and we've used it for snow, we've used it for rust. This show, we introduced a translucent grit paste. So the cool thing about that is you can see it's see-through, but our original grit paste was gesso-based. We know if we put gesso on something, it's just white, and there it is, and if you don't want it somewhere, it's gonna be too bold. So the transparent does allow us to create more organic texture. Rust on metal, rust on wood, rust around the edges of stuff, and if you don't put any color, you're still gonna see your pattern paper underneath. You're gonna see anything you want under it. So take a look at the texture of grit. So we have all four of those mediums. That's these guys right here. So we have texture paste, that's these crackle and matte, and then we have grit paste, opaque and translucent. And they're just in a smaller jar that again you can apply with a palette knife, a brush, anything like that. All right, so I think I covered all of that except for this little guy, and that's what I was talking about, the tin. So again, storage tins, I like to work with tins. I'm not really a storage organizer at home, right? I use an old hardware spinner for all of my stuff in my studio, but if you're going somewhere, going on a trip, or you just don't have the opportunity to store all your stuff on big shelves everywhere, storage tins are kind of cool. That's why we did them. And everybody wanted an ink pad storage tin. This holds 15 ink pads. You can see that it holds them apart, where you actually can take pork chop fingers and grab your ink pad,
Nice.
which is nice. You also know, if you've had distress through the years, that the lid's kind of like a game. Sometimes they fit perfect. Sometimes you flip over your ink pad and the lid falls off. So I wanted to make sure that regardless of when you got your inks, when you put it in there, it fits into this mold and it will hold your lid on airtight.
So it
Right.
comes with the mold. That's good to know.
Comes with it, yes.
Okay.
And for people that are already freaking their freak on social media, because after I did Facebook Live, they're like, but Tim, I don't like mine. I store mine upside down. They sleep like a bat. Whatever it is.
Sleep like a bat.
You could take this, insert, take it out, and flip it over, right? Because the idea with this is that it is stored like this. Some people just don't like to store their ink pads on their side. That's all right. I designed it that when you stand it up, my ink pads are sitting flat, right? Because it's not going to sit on the buckle part, right? It's designed to sit this way. But if you want to store your ink pads upside down because you'll sleep easier, you can pop out the insert, flip it over, and then technically they would be stored upside down, right? Or same thing, maybe you just want to work that way. Like this was designed that I can look at my labels when I open the tin. But if you've labeled them a different way and you want them, you can remove the insert. But you'll see that it just fits regulation size ink pads and oxide, 15 inks, and it's also stackable. So this one has a lip here and a recess here, so you can actually stack all your tins and they lock together.
That's awesome.
So it's pretty cool. It's just nice. And 15's enough. I mean, everybody always says, well, I want something that holds all 60 colors. I'm like, really?
You need 4.
Yeah, it's called the suitcase, because how are you going to carry it? So, been there, done that. You remember, I mean, I did tins back in the day. Remember my Cropper Hopper tins? Remember that one that I was like, ooh, I'm gonna make one that holds like all 60 Adirondack. And like, as soon as you picked it up, the handle fell off. Because like, it just got, right? The tin held it, but I'm like, ooh, and note to self, like the handle would get. So anyway, silly things. You learn, right? Live and learn is how that is. So I think I covered everything in the world of distress. Anything I didn't cover? No? Yes? No? Okay. Good. So I'm just going to play around with it. Oh, I'll talk about this. I didn't talk about this. This was a last minute thing. Yeah, this was a please. And I have Heidi to thank. Yeah. Remember, you got me thinking about collage medium, and you kind of cracked the ice for me. Heidi from Simon Says. Yeah. Yeah, because.
Credit's all yours.
Well, listen, I've wanted collage medium in all different things, and if you've ever used glossy accents, the tip of that glossy accent bottle is really nice, and I always wanted collage medium smaller and bigger, and Ranger's like, no, it's going to be in the jar, and that little squatty bottle is all you're going to get. But the great thing about this collage medium, it's in that fine tip like glossy accents, and now when you're doing detailed gluing, now we can just go in, besides that it holds double the glue, it's for all of my embellishments. Collage medium is everything. Because people ask all the time, what is the glue? And you can ask any, I mean, Stacey's over there shaking her head, any maker that makes every single thing in ideology, it is collage medium. There's nothing this cannot glue. It can glue glass to glass, metal to glass, fabric, paper, wood, you name it. The beauty of collage medium, besides that it dries completely matte and transparent, is that it shrinks when it dries. So when you go to glue a glass bottle down and you get glue ooze, when this dries, it will literally shrink behind that and dry.
That's
all right?
awesome.
So you will not get glue ooze through a button. You will not do any of that. It also has a drying time of now. So if you're going to use it to actually collage, right? I'll just show you just like some little dots of glue that I can get from this bottle, which is really cool. And I can get just tiny little dots from putting it on embellishments. But if you're going to use it like for ephemera, and you're going to use it out of a jar or a brush, right? I'll use collage medium just out of this, and I'll brush it on. If you put paper down, drying time of now, it's going to bond, right? But same thing really applies for embellishments, right? Although the medium itself doesn't dry instantly, the bond is instant. So when you put a metal embellishment on something, you can move it like quickly to position it, and then you need to leave it alone, because if you keep moving it, you're actually breaking that bond. So once it dries, your embellishment would fall off. So this is about like taking a bottle, think of like a gingerbread house. You ever made one with frosting? Like you stick in the peppermint, like there it is. You keep doing that, it's just gonna fall off when it dries. It's the same thing with collage medium. Put something on and leave it there. So yeah, that's the other thing. I don't think I forgot anything else after that. Awesome. All right. Any questions, or now I can just play? What time is it?
You can play.
Sweet. I have 15 minutes of playtime now. That's good.
Oh, sure. This one?
I'm just gonna play around.
These? Oh, sorry.
All right.
Did you try the embossing distress with the collage medium to dry like?
Let us. Right now.
Okay, cool.
That's what we do, right? Like, can we do this? Sure. It will work. I mean, I
Yeah.
know because it's a glue, but I want to see if I can get a cool brush stroke. Right? Why not?
Cool. All right.
That's the beauty. You have a color in mind? I do. I'm gonna do really good.
Pistachio. I always love pistachio.
Pistachio?
I always love pistachio. It's my favorite.
We'll do both. How about
Combo.
Are you bossing too?
Bossing, yeah. Am I bossing you? No.
that? No, I like that. So here I'm just going to take just some collage medium, and I'm just going to use it because if we're going in with some glue, like why not just see how that's just going to work? Because I'm curious how this glaze is going to go through, say, a brush stroke. All right. Let's just put some different colors down. I'm throwing some brown because
Of course. You gotta throw your brown
I
in.
know. Listen, I've been kind of reserving myself the whole time. So you don't need a lot, right? You don't need to be just a dumper on there. And then this is, so normally I would do this like over another piece of paper, whatever, but this
But
is
it's
the
not your
dance that I was
carpet.
telling you about, right? So see by just tapping underneath, see how those colors are like vibrating across the surface? And it's giving me a totally different speckled blend. Right? Because if you picked it up and did that, then that color is just going to dominate that. Okay. And then we'll heat it. So the whole thing with the glaze, really, just get it stuck on whatever it is while that whatever it is wet. Once it's on there, you can just go about your business and do your cleanup and all that before you emboss. Also take something dry and just wipe this off, in your hand and put it back in the jar or on someone else's carpet, right?
That's fair.
That's fair. but I can see already I'm in love. That brush stroke right there,
That's gonna be cool.
embossing a brush stroke is just as exciting as embossing a water drop, right? So thank you for that. That's awesome, right? Because it's just about the texture with the glaze. And this could have been over something already inked. We're just, yeah, it's giving it a totally different texture. And that is what I love about introducing different things into the distress world. It's just a different way to distress, a different medium, you know, using it over an oxide or using it over a paste or over an ink. This is good. Yeah, and if you're working on the media mat, you can just emboss directly on it. It's tempered glass, so you're not going to hurt this thing at all. Oh, look at that. Oh, that's awesome. I'm going to ink over this too.
So since the collage medium is a matte
Yes.
and this is glaze,
Yes.
what do you think will, the glaze will overpower the matte?
Yes, you'll see. Yeah, as soon as this melts, because remember the glaze is like a glazed donut, it's going on top. But if you didn't want it shiny, you could either collage medium over it again, and that would dull it down, or steel wool, and that would also dull it down. So this is going to melt with that glaze, that shine.
Oh,
But look
wow.
at those brush strokes
That's
from
cool.
that glue.
That's very cool.
That's really cool. So, I mean, and we're just looking at raw paper. Really, to appreciate the glaze and use them in their environment is to put it over something you've already done, over something you've already inked, because that's what's going to give that texture. That's what's going to give it all of those undertones to that color. Right now, this is just clear glaze, like nothing. But if this was already inked, all of those little colors will come through. So now you've inspired me. So tonight, before I leave the show floor, I'm just going to ink a bunch of paper, and I'll probably never emboss on plain paper again, because to me, I love the glaze over something that's already colored. I probably could use any of these swatches. But I'm gonna
Stamp
ink
over that with an archival ink and use a different glaze, or is that going to melt the ones underneath again to react with it?
Well, anytime you emboss on embossing, you do risk reheating this. But to be honest, if you stamped and glazed over it and just heat it, you'd be able to emboss it before you impacted this layer. Yeah, as long as you use the right kind of heat tool. Like, use something like this because it is very instant. If you use the Reinker one, because it disperses the heat, it would eventually heat all of this. And different papers also work different with embossing powders too. If you work on papers that are very porous, right? Because like in a lot of journals, there's really great raw watercolor paper or chipboard. Because this is a plastic, if you heat this long enough, you can get it so liquid that it will actually immerse itself into its paper, which could also be cool. Because this now is a resist. When I go over it with any kind of ink, any color, what I'm going to use, let's go over it with some oxide. Let's go over it with these.
Because it'd be cool to figure out like a dripping effect almost.
Yeah, you could get just some really, really cool effects on here. So an oxide, because it has a pigment, that's going to now impact the top color, but it'll also work as a resist. So hold on a second. Don't freak out.
Do you just say don't freak out?
Yeah, don't freak out.
Is that because you just,
See?
it works.
Yeah, it does. It works. If you're careful, it's good. You know, if you were just to totally abuse this, then yeah, you could. The only thing that you ever have to worry about in the world of contamination is this and ink.
Oh.
Yeah. You can really double dip. It just dirties the felt, but you could wipe it off, and you're not going to damage your ink pads. But if you went an oxide into this and you introduce pigment into this distress, you'll change its whole dynamic, right?
Okay.
So here, let's play around with some water. So now we're going to get our oxides to kind of do its thing, but it's still going to oxidize on top of that. But now I'm going to go to my heat tool, right? So by using my heat tool, it's never going to get hot enough, quick enough to remelt that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's why I was saying using the right tool. Now I'm going to be able to dry my ink and my oxide over that glaze, and it will dull the glaze because the oxide oxidizes. I'm telling you, like I always say I can't wait till you guys get it in your hands, because what you're going to do with it is just going to even be more magical than what I dreamed of. That's what makes this creative industry awesome, is all of you guys. That's it. We're just the immediate idea people. You are the inspiration. It's the truth. That's what I love. Look at that. Oh,
That's
sweet
big.
mother of glory. That is beautiful. Yeah. And even you can see where the collage medium was that I didn't put powder, it's going to act as a resist.
Yeah. You can stamp into it. That's what I've done before. Stamp
Yeah.
into the collage medium and then
It's
do
so
that.
good.
Yeah, I love that.
But you got to work quick, because if you let collage medium dry on your stamp, well, it's an embellishment.
I know.
Yeah.
That's how
Same
you
with-
can break a stamp.
That's okay.
I did that like the first time. All right, I'm just gonna let this cool for a second because it's still
You were gonna-
plastic.
yeah.
It's still plastic, so I just want to make sure that I don't, get any strings or stickiness. But I do want to dab this because that's going to create more of that white than just a color. Wow, that's just ridiculous. That's phenomenal. That gave it just a whole other level of good. I mean, from brush stroke to using oxide, like, here, I'll pass this around to you, like, feel it, because that to me is
cool.
very interesting when we're working with mediums. It is all about not only color and depth, but texture, and I think that's what that was really the inspiration is, yeah, I could create color and I could go over something with glossy accents or just clear powder, but to have a glaze that's going to be translucent, so it's like, thinking of it's like powdered inks almost, where we're going to sprinkle this on, and yeah, awesome guys, very, very cool. All right, I'm going to clean this up. There are 12 colors. Yeah, 12 colors to start. It's up to you, America, and the world, because the whole thing about colors is really up to how people like it. When I did Facebook Live, there were a lot of crabby people that we didn't have new colors of archivals, and I'm like,
Gotta ask for it.
y'all just did it. Yeah, that's just what it is. It's very interesting. Yeah, people think, oh, you're Tim Holtz. You just ask for it and they just do it. I'm like, no, it doesn't work that way. I've been Tim Holtz my whole life. It doesn't work that way. It is. It's what people use. So I too want more colors of archival, and I want more glazes. So I think that the more people use and share, that's what impacts them. I mean, think about it. We got all of those oxide sprays in the first year. Why? Because when we released them at Creativation last year, social media blew up, and they wouldn't give Reinker a break. And it's like, thank you guys, because that's what kept them releasing more colors and more colors, and that's really what it is. It's that if we use them and we like them, then they'll continue to invest.
And you're
in
never
more
going to
colors.
have the oxides in the smaller because of the properties of it. Is that correct?
It doesn't stay well. I mean, you can put it on there, but really over time, these two mediums, the dye and pigment, go away. So never say never, because we've been working on it since we released it, but we're just still not there. So the chemists are looking for some type of resin, is what he says, some type of resin that will keep the dye and the pigment happy on. It's about surface tension. He's got all sorts of different reasons, but like when an ink pad's made, this material, this felt, because it's a felt, if this was a foam, it'd be different, right? Because most pigment pads are that squishy foam. A pigment likes to live in foam, but a pigment doesn't like to live on felt, right? It wants to separate like oil and water. But on this, they soak it in the ink, they run it through a roller which kind of pushes everything out, and ink is a suspended medium. That's why that whole myth of, oh, your inks are going to drip down the side. I'm like, no, they just kind of sit there. But on this, because there's not enough surface, that's where the dye and pigment just starts to separate. Not necessarily to the edge, but it just doesn't.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't play well over time. If we were makers that were actual consumers, we're not. We're collectors, and I get that. I'm one of you. I totally get it. We want it in every color first and then decide if we want to use it. Well, not you. You're like, I'm going to buy this and hate this, and then I'll buy more colors of it, and that's totally all right. So you validate us all. We aspire to be, I think, a little bit more reserved in our purchases. But yeah, she's like, yeah. She's like, you don't know.
Yeah, you get what you get.
That's right.
Yeah.
2 or 3.
But this is like,
Sorry.
it's the time that over time it's just not stable, but we are working on it, so I'll never say never. So maybe it's not this, maybe it's a little bigger, and I told them that, like, maybe it's, but I really want this. I don't want to settle for something bigger. Yeah. Any other
What if you
questions?
put 2 or 3 of these together in a little shaker?
So they'll blend. So just like this, if you look
So
at
you
this
get
one
like a
embossed,
speckled kind of.
well, these colors when they liquefy, so if you just embossed it in one stage, then yes, they would remain speckled. But the
Yeah.
longer you heat these, because they're liquid, they'll start
blend
to
and
blend together. So
create
I've
a
already
new-
mixed the glaze with clear, and it does give you more of that speckled kind of graniteware look, because now you're dispensing the colored crystals with the clear. I've also used it with frosted crystal. So Reinker has an embossing powder called frosted crystal, which is more of like a matte embossing powder. So it does dull these even more. So when you mix this with frosted crystal, it's not as shiny. It still has some gloss, but it's just a little duller. So, I really plan on doing a lot of things, but what you have to be careful of is if you mix these with opaque powders, the opaque powder will dominate the transparent color.
Okay, and
Right.
that's.
So if you said, "Ooh, I'm gonna mix fired brick with my red embossing powder," it's just gonna look red, because that that opaque powder will just dominate anything translucent.
Because it's
But-
opaque.
because it's opaque, yeah. And that's really why I wanted to even instill this whole glaze word. That's why I said I didn't invent the powder, it's still embossing powder, but to have a line of full translucent powders that you know when it melts, where's that weird little thumb swatch that I did? Here we go. That you know that when it melts in its first layer, it is going to give you that color. It is going to give you tattered rose, it is going to give you fired brick, rusty hinge, fossilized amber. That is, same thing if I took ink and just smudge it with my finger, that's it. But the more color you add, just like the more distress ink you have, the more intense the color is. But rusty hinge is never going to be walnut stain. No matter how many layers, it's just going to be a deeper rusty hinge. This will never be aged mahogany or anything like that. So, but to me, it's a great palette to start with. I love it. I'm just, every single day, just the more I play with it. And that's another thing. Everyone thinks that like we have this product years ago. Terry's over there from Reinker, she's smiling. I'm like, yeah, we pretty much get the new product on our hand like, a month or so before the trade show, and they're like, there you go. Yeah, figure out what you're gonna do with it, because it's showtime until sometimes a week before. Yeah, sometimes stuff just arrives like the day before stuff, but yeah, I love it. I hope you guys enjoy it. I can't wait
so
to
much.
see it.
Thank you.
It's all shipping in February, so next month. So it's already in production. Nobody has, Ranger's really done an awesome job, not only with this, but the alcohol ink line and all the products of getting stuff to market much quicker. And I think it's important in our industry now, Yeah, there are some products, like what I did with Tonic that's not going to ship for a while, but I think the more you just kind of say it right up front, like, hey, we got to wait, nobody wants to wait.
We want everything
now.
Yeah.
We want it, yeah.
Order it.
Consumer.
I said
Here
we're in
tomorrow.
an Amazon world. We're like, we
That's
want
what I was
it
thinking.
now.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm prime. My life is prime. Yeah. 2 days is even.
That's
That's
a long
even a long
time.
time. People in California, they're like Amazon now or something. Yeah, it's like what is that? Yeah, we don't have that. Yeah, I don't have that. I'm good with 2 day, but yeah. But I do really. I think that because we have so much social media, like share. Right? That's what it is. Don't get in your own head where you think you're not great enough to share, you don't have enough followers to share, or share. We're all in this to just inspire each other. This is not about numbers and likes and followers. This is just about you being you, and you being authentically you is your contribution to our industry. That's really what it is.
Hashtag support each other.
Because look what I just did. I brushed glue on a tag, for crying out loud, and that in itself inspired a whole little demo of like, well, what would happen if this? I have no idea. This could have been horrible, but at the same time, could not. So share what you do, and I think that's what's going to continue to help our industry thrive. It really is.
Thank you.
And we know that. Thank you guys, really. I appreciate it.
Thank
I'll be back
you.
in an hour to do
All
alcohol
right.
ink. So
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye guys. Bye.